Welcome. I'm Bishop Megan Rohr of the Sierra Pacific Synod, and we're going to begin tonight with a little bit of a blessing because we'll be talking about poetry, and we might as well start with a little poetry and some words. And so, God, be with us abundantly in our hearts, floating through our bloodstream, in the breath that leaves our vibrating vocal cords. Help us to sing you, help us to walk you, help us to be you, palpably present in this world. The earth and all that it is a blessing to us. All of the creatures, those who waddle and walk and swim and fly, are a blessing to us. The trees and the plants and the mountains are a blessing to us. Even that which agitates us from within is a reminder to focus on you. Bring us present wherever we gather. Center our spirits, focus our love, and bring us here. Amen. Guest, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Aileen Cassinetto. I'm the current Poet Laureate of the County of San Mateo in Northern California, San Francisco Bay Area. I'm an immigrant poet and a community poet, which means that I write about my diaspora, about my community, my history and issues of race, gender, and class as I witness them. And the way I approach my writing is also how I approach my work as Poet Laureate. It means constantly looking at the communities I serve and asking who is being left behind and how can I make poetry more accessible for them. Bishop Megan, I thank you so much for inviting me here today. My body of work is really informed also by my faith, and I do not mean denomination. Although I was baptized Catholic as an infant, I remember in the early 2000s when I was a fairly new immigrant, and I was feeling very lost. And I was living in Philadelphia at the time. I found myself inside this 300-year-old Baptist church that was unusual in that it was so stunningly diverse. It was also welcoming and affirming, and I didn't know what it meant at the time, but all I knew was that this church community genuinely welcomed everybody, and that was life-changing for me. I thought that was how it should be. So when I write a poem, it doesn't always show it, but it's there. The faith that got me through the worst of times, and the faith that sustains my poetry and all its attendant possibilities. That's a pretty long intro.
No, it's wonderful. I think we live in really kind of wacky times right now, and I think there's got to be a kind of bravery that goes into being a poet laureate during these times. I know that for me, the ways that people started putting quilts together during the AIDS crisis, and they found ways that art could speak to tragedy is part of what helped people get through. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what it's been like for you to be a poet laureate in the midst of a global pandemic.
At first, it was my initial reaction was that I was concerned about not being able to reach people. But then a Zoom came along, and also I realized poetry was such an important tool during the pandemic. It was able to amplify the most marginalized voices. And it's really the great equalizer, and certainly one of our most democratic forms of artistic expression. It has helped me personally process and understand the world, especially in the midst of quarantine and trauma and political unrest. And I've noticed people, even non-poets, turning to poetry as a survival mechanism and a way to heal and reimagine the future. And poetry allows us to write about our vulnerabilities in non-linear, abstract ways. It's like having a shield, like we're given an added layer of protection so that we're not too vulnerable. And personally, also, I've noticed that it was this great community builder. Last year, I curated a community poem for healthcare workers and frontliners, which raised money for the San Mateo County Health Foundation. And because of the poem's theme and unified voice, it found its way to different venues around the country, like in Connecticut for Memorial Day, and the Alzheimer's Poetry Project in Minnesota, and the Montgomery Independent School District in Texas. So it was an example of how a poem can live a life beyond what the poets have envisioned.
Well, I'm curious when you talk about like curating a group poem, what does that process look like?
So I send out mass emails and just post on Nextdoor and other social media asking people to send me. I give a prompt, and I just asked them um, if they had a message for healthcare workers, frontliners, or anybody in their family who's working in the front lines to send them to me, and then I kind of collated the all the messages and then worked them into a more kind of unified structure so that it kind of read more like a poem with the line breaks and the musicality that people look for in a poem. So it's and so at the end, you have this very we had this very long poem that kind of it sounded like it's one person speaking, but it's really many different people. Um, so and
I
it,
like,
yes.
but I like that as an idea about like creating liturgy. I could see how a
Mhm.
community could
Yes.
maybe make a group Advent poem or a group Lenten poem or a poem Reformation poem, right?
Yes.
Of whatever kind of common sentiment might be living in the community. Yeah.
Exactly. It's something that, everyone, it's like having this large kitchen table where everyone can, has a voice. Everyone has a say in the matter, and everyone contributes.
Well, there's kind of in the midst of this, I think, been times, maybe pockets of time where the grief and the trauma of it all has been a lot. And so there are times when I think people feel very creative and inspired, and then other times where people just want to hide under their blankets
Mhm.
and kind of wait for the pandemic to all be over. Do you have anything that you do to try to help your creativity blossom or to find ways to make inspiration happen, especially in difficult times like this?
Yes. So this a poet I admire, Mary Riffel, has said that the struggle of writing requires patience and faith, and this is especially true for me. I find that when I'm going through periods of creative burnout or unrest, um, sometimes the best way for me to deal with them is to just take a break and do something else, like taking a walk or ironing or reading a good mystery novel to relax the mind. Um, or if I have a deadline, I try to like read different magazines, not necessarily about poetry. I read a lot of National Geographic, Nature Journal, or Reader's Digest, and almost always a word or a line or an idea catches my attention, which I then incorporate into the poem. I've seen how inspiration can come from the most mundane activity or the most ordinary object. And I'm not going to lie, writing doesn't come easy for me. I wrestle with every line. Um, I read lots of material just to find that one perfect word. And this is also where faith comes in for me. I just trust that an idea is on its way, and soon the poem will reveal itself. Um,
Yeah, it seems a little bit like trying to listen for the Holy Spirit to kind of
exactly,
whisper a little bit,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, and I do pray before writing a poem.
Yeah.
It's a big secret, but I do that. Um, yeah, and other poets have also given me a lot of inspiration.
Mm. Are
Um,
there any poets in particular that speak to you, particularly in difficult times, or that have helped you kind of, you know,
yeah.
be
Um,
inspired?
yes. So Mary Oliver has always been a source of inspiration for me. Um, I know this. She wrote these unforgettable lines like, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And that line never fails to give me a jolt. I love that her poems are anchored in hope, that they shine a light on the commonplace and a way out of the brokenness. Um, when I'm also drawn to poets and poems that inspire movements and grandness and rouse our most noble intentions. Um, I've been inspired by poems of resistance by Janice Marie Kitani, and I've drawn strength from the words of Audre Lorde, who had shown me how important it is to affirm and celebrate and nurture our differences. And of course, the work of my fellow Filipino poets always speak to me and inspire me. Um, I recommend reading the work of Reme Grifalda, Aileen Tavios, Luisa Igloria, Angela Narciso Torres, Barbara Jane Reyes, and so many more. Um, um, I also um, I also recommend, if for those who would like to take up the habit of just pausing and listening to poetry, I highly recommend poet and theologian Patrick Otuma's podcast. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's Poetry Unbound. It invites listeners to slow down, listen to poetry, reflect, and recharge for 12 minutes every week. It's a very soothing and welcoming space in the midst of a very hurried world. Also, a great way to start and end the work week.
Yeah, I like that, trying to kind of like
Mhm.
be into the rhythm of it. And the nice thing about that it is
Mm,
that it doesn't expect everyone to become a poet magically at
right.
the end of it, right? That you can just go to poetry to kind of like think about some of the inspiring words that are working for you. And there, some of my favorite parts of scripture are poetry as well, right? And so like the Psalms are poetry, Song of Songs is poet. It's a little smuttier than Psalms, but it's poetry still, right? Like this idea of like leaping gazelles and green hills and couches and all kinds of things that are inspiring ways to be able to like notice God in the world. And I think that for me is has been a part of my journey. I also like think about like the sermons of Martin Luther King Jr. Part of the reasons that for me they kind of cling inside of my belly is that he had this really beautiful way of memorizing some of the biblical poetry and stitching it into his sermons, not in ways that like when he was talking about several of the scriptural references, I always want to like go back and read those texts, and I assume that those texts are going to be as beautiful as he put them together in his speeches. And sometimes everything that comes before and after is like about like destroying the Moabites and things like that. Like it's not, he had this beautiful way of like lifting out one beautiful poetic phrase in the midst of like a couple of texts that are hard for me to sit with.
Mhm.
And so I just thought there was something really lovely about the way he would just collect. It was like he would just collect them like a collage and then string them together in the midst of all the other words that he's saying, so that those who also had read some of those texts, so they knew that he was speaking with sacred words about God, but they weren't necessarily being used in the exact same tone as the original. And there's something for me that's been really like making me go back to those words again and again, because it kind of included some of the poetry in it, right?
Exactly. And it also helped that he really spoke with such conviction and genuineness. And um, he he just spoke to people who needed to hear what he was saying at the time. And a lot of people now probably will not admit to drawing inspiration from the Bible. Um, but even for non-Christians, you have to admit that the Bible is a literary book with poetic features. Like my sister and I worked on a wedding liturgy a few years ago. We're not liturgists, but we worked in this liturgy that was based on the Song of Songs. It's something that we wanted to be part of a wedding ceremony, and it would be. I think it would be something I would like to see in a church service. I also came across this book, Poetry as Liturgy, which is a collection of poems organized in the order of worship, which I find to be very unusual and creative. I think for a lot of people, there's this kind of fatigue about being, they've been probably been burned or too bombarded by too much by the negative aspects of I wouldn't say Christianity, but people who profess to be Christians. But um, I mean, being a Christian, it's really all about love. It's not about hating and excluding people. So I think focusing on a lot of like I mentioned earlier before the program, I really appreciated your Beatles mass, um, giving people these platforms and ways of worshiping without triggering all the negative experiences they've had. I think it's a way to. I mean, you just have to give people hope. Um, I think that's I think that's what we're here for.
Well, and I've been thinking a lot about how for some people the negative words or the negative things that people say in the world sometimes stick a lot closer than the positive things.
Right.
And how like if 8 people give feedback at the end of the sermon, sometimes the only one that's remembered is the one that was negative. So that means 7 people had great feedback and one person had negative feedback. But the way that our minds sometimes work is that we can cling to the one that was negative and hold on to it for a really long time. It's like we've evicted the positive comments and we've let the negative one get tenancy rights in our brain. And so I've been thinking a lot about how we can flip that. Like, how can we give more weight and more balance to like the positive stuff? And I wonder if there's something about poetry that is a part of that. But I think poetry definitely can also be angry. Like
Mhm.
Langston Hughes is pretty awesome. Like Audre Lorde has a way of sticking it to people, like even in a way that sounds pretty, where you're like, thank you for sticking it to me, right? So I'm not saying it only has to be pretty or it only has to be positive, but I wonder if there is something that could be self-care in times like these, to try to just be a collector of the positive words that we encounter in our day, or a collector of the positive words in scripture, and to try to like balance it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I think one great example would be Amanda Gorman, because when she delivered that inaugural poem, she just opened the door for every poet in the universe. She just gave a platform and a voice, and just included everybody. And I think she in an interview she said that she wasn't shying away from the problems we have as a country, but she wanted her poem to heal people, at the same time not to disregard um, all the issues that we have regarding race and gender and class, and just kind of um, facing all these things as a people, and finding starting a conversation, and finding solutions together. Um, so I think what poetry does is that it teaches us to pause, to look beyond the surface of things, at what connects us with the world and with each other. It looks it's this intersectional space that that you have the poetic license to look at human ecology, earth systems, ecosystems, and human relationships. That invites people. It can be disarming, and it invites introspection, and hopefully we want conversations to happen. um, I think poetry resonates because we each carry within us, in equal measure, a world of trauma and boundless grace, which is why and poems a poem is born of both ferocity and gentleness, which each of us encounters directly or indirectly in our daily life. So a poem, especially when it even if it's a hard poem to read, it speaks to us because it is our shared humanity in a nutshell. So just getting people um, to listen, to pause and listen, and hopefully invite conversation, find connections. That can be a very healing environment. I hope that answered. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like, and I'm gonna just sit and marinate for a while on this idea that there is equal measure trauma and boundless grace. Like that for me is a wonderful way of like looking at some of the ways that our world is happening right now. Um, do you have any tips for how we can slow down? Because so many parts of our life are about hurrying up, right? We don't like to wait in lines. We want to like have the information right away in the tips of our hands. Like, do you have tips for how we can slow ourselves down enough to notice the poetry that's all around us, even the poetry that's not written down yet, but just exists in the world?
I think it's just kind of making a conscious effort to pause maybe a few minutes each day. Just make a conscious effort to pay attention. I believe that at the root of inspiration is the interconnectedness of all life. For instance, my craft and daily practice are deeply entwined with the Filipino core value of kapwa, which means shared identity or interrelatedness. Um, this means that part of what informs my work as a poet is always about looking for connections. And if it's not there, creating intersectional spaces so um, everyone can have a place at the table. Um, and I find that that has worked for me. I find that if something resonated with me and I worked it in a poem, hopefully so it will resonate with someone else too. And uh, you only have to reach that one person who needs to hear it, um, and start from there.
I like that idea of trying to look for the shared identities.
Mm.
And I wonder too, like we've been trying to kind of dwell in the idea of um, just Lutheran, or this
Mm.
process of listening to people who do different kinds of jobs or have different kinds of identities, and to think about ways that we can actively try to decrease the places where bias might linger
Mhm.
in church spaces, also in us as faithful people. And I've been really listening to the way that you're talking about poetry being an intersectional act. Is when you're thinking about that, I'm hearing you both talk about poetry that is creative on a communal level and poetry that is created on an individual level. And
Mhm.
just wondering, do you have any, maybe you haven't worked this out yet, but do you have any tips for those who are trying to intentionally be intersectional in their liturgy writing or in their hymn writing or in the ways that we work on writing words for church together, whether or not we think of it as poetry? I think it is, but do you have ideas about how we can write that in ways that are leaning towards intersectional or towards a shared identity?
I just find that just being mindful, being in the moment, and just listening to people, um, it just opens up a whole new world. Like I said, um, I find inspiration from practically everything and everyone. It doesn't have to be, if you're writing liturgy, it doesn't have to be. Yes, the Bible can figure in there, but also your lived experience, someone else's lived experience, cultural memory, prayer, other cultures, um, and something almost always resonates. I hope that um, made sense.
Well, even if it doesn't make sense, it's poetic, right? So it still works, I think. Um, I'm wondering if you have any favorite sacred texts that you think are good examples of poetry or that inspire you.
Oh my goodness, I was just a friend of mine posted something about being posted on Facebook about being very depressed today and just asking for prayer. And so my sister and I were texting each other about verses that kind of helped us get through um, some of the worst times. And I love Isaiah's a verse about "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Um, and um, you have to. People can get very defensive when listening to Bible verses, but you have to come from probably a place of faith and trust, that um, not I mean I cannot explain it in a the way a theologian would, but um I just know that these verses have helped me, and if they can help someone else too, um I love sharing them with people. um it doesn't always, like I said, it doesn't always show it in my work, but this faith, it's always in every poem. It's and it's faith that I think really doesn't depend on any denomination or church community. It's something um that you carry with you because it didn't fail you before. So that's how it is for me. um it's kind of like having, hopefully, the faith of a child. No matter what you say, this is what I believe. And if I can, I'm not trying to convert anyone, but this is what has helped me. And um, and I love verses that give people hope. And it's too simplistic, I'm still here. I mean, the fact that I'm here, it's pretty radical. Being, immigrating, as an adult, and um, I come from a background of class-based struggle, and I'm coming here to the States. It's a whole different ballgame. It's not just class; it's race-based, it's gender-based, and just trying to survive each day. You have to have something to center you, and this is it for me.
Well, and in case you were wondering, it's also inspiring some other people as well. Lots of heart emojis throughout our comments today. I'm wondering if there is any part of your poetry that is not on the cheerful side. Do you have poetic lament and times when anger or fear or things like that are also coming out in your words? And if so, does that feel different? Are there ways that you rework a poem that's different when it's feelings on the other side of that coin?
Yeah, actually, every poem I write, it has, um, of course, I try to polish it, but there's heartache and violence. But I always want to temper it with love and hope. I think if I may share a poem that I wrote, this poem was a statement on immigration and movement and gender. But I also wanted it to be a poem of love and redemption, and I'd like to share it with you. Um, Still, like air, we rise toward the light, our movement widening as though in prayer, holy and urgent. I will say your name, an act of love more powerful than the weight of air or the falling of light, like clouds speaking their truth, every heap and layer, every curl of hair a reckoning. Still, I pray for grace to hear your story and what you know of clouds, why they shine at night, where they touch the ground, how they birth a star. Perhaps you will want to know my story and why these queries, like what will it cost to cross an inch of scorn or climb a wall of fear? How much to plow the air to read the clouds? How much for a sip of water, a gulp of air? How much for 3 square feet of space, for the narrowest breathing place? How much for the life of my child? Still I ask, an act of grace as I rise toward the light. And that's the poem.
Wow, that's amazing. It makes me well, you were telling me earlier before we went live that you were hoping that we would plan a liturgy
Mhm.
that is poetry based, right? For especially for April when it's National Poetry Month. And I think that poem right there is kind of perfectly timed for that time period because that's right in the heart of Lent. And I don't know, it spoke to me kind of a Lenten journey I mean, I think it's maybe even an Advent poem too, depending upon which side you flip it on. Mary riding on a donkey across the desert probably wondered how much it cost for an inch of scorn as well, right?
Right.
Yeah, yeah, that was really beautiful.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
I'm really excited about listening to um, when you have a mass that's based on poetry. That would be very exciting. And like I said, I'm really glad that you are in the position you are in, because it uplifts so many marginalized voices, not just uh, the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
It's immigrants, people of color. It's every voice that never had a platform before. When you were elected to be bishop, that elevated all those voices.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I hope that you'll be willing to help me write the mass because I think it would be really great to have I think our synod is really interested in being the kind of place where we accompany people who are on kind of a migrant journey or on a refugee journey or in need of sanctuary, kind of in the ways that travel and movement happens. And I could see a poetry mass being a way to kind of touch into the depths of what's hard about those journeys,
Mm-hmm.
but also, like you're saying, holding up the grace and holding up the faith of what people are journeying for, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Would you be willing to share a little more about your personal kind of journey, your personal migrant journey?
Yeah. Um, so I grew up in the Philippines during martial law. This was when the Philippines is very it's a very complex place. We've been colonized by Spain for 300 years, and then the U.S. for another 50 years. So there's a lot of thing to decolonize. So and after that, martial law came. We were under dictatorship for 2 decades, and so it's probably why my writings are rooted in historical and socio-political context, because that's what I know. And like I said, it doesn't always show it, but um, whenever a poet writes a poem, it's there, all the sum total of a poet's journey. Um, and and then I'm also a product of chain migration. So I joined my parents in 2000, and being an immigrant is really hard, um, economically, mentally, emotionally, and I find that it really didn't. I find myself looking for safe, sacred spaces, even now when I'm more settled. That was why I was very grateful to have found that church in Philadelphia. Didn't matter. I'm glad that they had a strong Black tradition, but also, like I said, they were welcoming and affirming and very diverse. So um, it didn't matter that they were not Catholic, although I just wanted a place that would get me through, just survive the day, and live another day. And I think it's the same for a lot of people. Um, so any church that gives people hope, that's how it should be.
And it's I think, I don't know if you've had experiences with this, but in the Bay Area where we are both currently, it's been a rough time for folk who are Asian and Pacific Islander. Over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of hate crimes. There's been a lot of, I don't know, racism from the top, if that's the way to say it, against Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And so it's been a difficult road, kind of, regardless of what your immigration and migrant journey is. And so I haven't had to live into your skin or into your journey, but I can only imagine how moving from one place to the next, and coming to a place hoping that it's going to be perhaps safer, perhaps more opportunities, perhaps a place of finding deep connection. How has it been over the last 2 years, as it's been maybe it's only getting more publicity now, but a time where there's been some pretty public acts of Asian and Pacific Islander hate crimes and hate speech?
You know, people, I find that people fear what they don't know. Um, and I've in the last 2 years, Asian groups have been working really hard to push back, and also um, worked with other, like in Oakland, Asian and Black communities have been working together to support and protect each other. It's, I think people probably need to realize that Asians or Asian Americans are not, we're not a monolithic group. Although we have, um, in the 70s, um, we've banded together, because it's because there's a common agenda, and um, we're stronger together. Um, but like I said, it's been hard for, there's a lot of distrust also. We worked on this short documentary in San Mateo County um, of what Asian Americans are going through, but we made it so other um, ethnicities are also welcome allies to speak up. And we've been fortunate that here in the county, um, the leadership has been very supportive and very vigilant about it, to protect members of the community. And I think what we do is just, we look out for each other, and call out racism when it happens. I've encountered also, and this was in San Francisco, in the financial district. I was having coffee one morning, and somebody came up and said, "We don't want you here." So those are kind of hurtful experiences. Although it's probably more hurtful that we're not very surprised by it, that because it's happened other times. So you're just grateful for also for the support of other people, for people speaking out when it's needed.
In times when there are folk who are, I don't know, vomiting Asian Pacific Islander hate. I don't know a better way to say it, but when there are times when it's maybe more publicly present, are there things that folk like me can do that are helpful and supportive in tangible ways?
There's this website, Stop Asian Hate, that AAPI Hate, that tracks these incidents, and and adds them to a database. And um, they've been very effective in advocating and speaking up about the issue. And I think that's a one way to start. When you see something that's not right, you report it. Go to Stop AAPI Hate, or support a local AAPI organization. Um, um, and there are many here in the Bay Area. Um, I would also say probably reach out to AAPI artists who have programs or events that are focused on the issue, and supporting that as well. Because probably the more people realize what's happening, or the more people understand um, someone, there would be less of the less of the hate going around. Um, so I hope that helps.
Yeah, well, and I think part of what you've been talking about tonight is like ways that we can amplify voices of folk who kind of have the most at stake in any given issue, and ways that we can weave together storytelling and help people, like the way that you were talking about crafting a poem so that it can help others feel like they care about that issue too, or as a way of seeing it as a lens. And so I'm very intrigued by this idea of trying to write communal poetry together, and wondering if that's a way to make it feel like people are sewn together a little bit more, right?
Exactly. People, it makes people feel invested
Yeah.
and pay more attention to an issue, and raise the profile of that issue. Definitely.
Are there ways that you have seen it where it has worked to kind of do impromptu poetry in a group, or do you think it's something that's easier if you give people the time and the thought and the attention to write it down and sit with it and ponder and then turn it in over a period of time? What do you think?
In poetry exercises, it's a good way to. We actually just had a youth workshop on eco poetry, and we asked them to write 5 things about what they see, what they hear, um, what they feel in terms of their immediate environment, and then once they've written down those observations, we divided them into groups, and they put their lines or words together, and um, and then you always have a poem at the end which you can polish later on. So it's possible to do it impromptu. Probably the emotions would be more raw, um, and then it also probably will help to give people more time. With the community poem that I did for healthcare workers, um, I gave them a deadline. Um, so, and at the time, people wanted to do something. Um, I guess in periods of in that one moment, people are more united and more generous and wanted to help out. So I received a lot of submissions. Um, I suggest probably having a workshop, and then polishing the poem that you use for the liturgy. So
I appreciate that. That's really helpful. I want to try to do some more collective poetry writing with folk about the sacred that they notice in the world.
mhm.
And if folk are watching this now or later, and you want to add poetic words in the chat box, just add a bunch of poetic words, and we'll see if they fit together into anything interesting. Or maybe they just live on their own. It's fine.
Yeah, we actually just had also this national organization welcoming week.
Mm.
San Mateo County participated in that. It's every year, and what we did was it's really focused on immigrant communities.
Mhm.
So what we did was we again asked people to submit lines, how they feel about um, immigrants, how would they welcome them. So we were able to come up with this really beautiful poem that doesn't disregard the challenges, but ends on a very hopeful note. And that's really what you want in a community poem.
I like that. You've really inspired me to try to think of ways that I can do some more personal writing. I have had this practice when I travel to different places, that I write prayers where I go, and I put them together in little prayer books, and if I'm honest, they're each little poems, right? And so I think all the things that you've been talking about are also like ways that people can write prayers, and
Exactly.
particularly if we think about having prayers of the people,
Mm,
like any way that we can teach folk how to craft their own little poem or their own little prayer or their own little psalm, helps our liturgies all become better. And yeah, I
yes,
kind of I kind of have always thought that, like, if God is like a kaleidoscope and we all get our own little angle of noticing God, then we need all the poems, we need all the words so that we can have as many ways of seeing what God is up to as possible.
exactly. I mean, prayers of the people can be very poetic by itself, but when you put it together, you have kind of like this view of the world, people's intentions, requests, hopes, fears, and it can be a very layered, very powerful poem. And that hopefully we always hope that a poem can doesn't stop there. That what we want is to have more conversations, because the more we talk, the more we understand each other, the more we find common solutions.
I like that. And if people want to learn more about you, they can go to your website. I put it
Yes.
right here if they're interested. Are there other ways that folk can connect with you if they want to learn more about what you're up to in San Mateo County and in the world in general?
Yes, they can always email me, SMC Poet Laureate, that's one word, at smcl.org, or through my Facebook page, or Instagram and Twitter at SM County PL.
That's really wonderful. Do you have another poem you want to share with us? If
Um,
you
um,
don't, because I didn't ask you beforehand. I'm just asking if you do.
Let me pull up something.
Okay.
Um, so um, this poem is a nature poem. It speaks to the effects of climate change, in particular our California wildfires. Um, I wanted to show that while the situation is dire, there is always hope. And the title is Fireborn. I once went wild over repurposed things: tweeds, beads, driftwood, silvery wormwood got worked into frames, footgear, chandeliers. My favorite, though, is a floor lamp from a limb trimmed from an old manzanita, the color of burnished red pear. Wild child of the last wildfire, evergreen and unsparing. Our gratitude for the little apples and the many equally wild and resolute things that fed on them. That charm of hummingbirds, that grist of bees, that flutter of butterflies. You were the kindling and the offering, the time worn prayer above the movement of air. That's the poem.
That's really beautiful. It's been lovely of you to spend this time with us. I'm so delighted that you are a poet laureate so near to where I am. Make no mistake, as a San Franciscan, you are welcome in San Francisco. And I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing and for the ways that you're inspiring us to share our stories and to be intersectional, both in individual and communal ways. So I offer you a blessing of love and hope. May all the words that trickle from your tongue be replicas of your heart, that when they float into the world, the communities you're speaking to feel seen and see you. Amen.
Thank you. Amen. Thank you, Bishop Megan. That means a lot. Thank you,
Absolutely.
everyone, for listening.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everybody.